It was such a beautiful wedding feast. The music, the dancing, the food, the wine, everything was wonderful. There was a burst of laughter just then, and Mary looked over at a table where Jesus and his friends had gathered. Jesus, filled with joy, had finished his story. The whole table had broken out into laughter. Mary just shook her head with a smile. He always makes people so joyful with his stories, she thought to herself. She leaned against a tall, empty water jar as she watched, her heart filled with love as she looked at her son. And she remembered another joyful event now some 30 years ago, when she and Joseph had carried their newborn son into the temple in Jerusalem. An old man named Simeon had come up to them and asked to hold the child. With tears in his eyes, he held the baby up high and said to God, "Now, Lord, now you may let me go. I have seen your salvation." But suddenly the other words that Simeon had spoken that day came to her mind. His words, spoken so long ago, now seemed so clear and so strong. When in the temple, Simeon had turned to Mary and quietly said, "This child will be the cause of the fall and the rise of many in Israel." And then he touched her shoulder gently and said, "And you, dear mother, will have your heart pierced in pain." She and Joseph had talked about what Simeon had said many times over the years. They knew that Jesus was sent by God. She never forgot the words of the archangel Gabriel. She knew he was the promised Messiah, but he was always just her Jesus. He was their little boy who had played in the sawdust of the workshop, ran up and down the hills of their tiny town with the other boys, and learned his scriptures. But since that long ago day in the temple, Mary knew what the pain, like a sword piercing her heart, was like. She remembered how agonizing it was to be separated from her son for those 3 days, only to find him in the temple with the elders. She remembered when Joseph had died, and how Jesus became her great support and companion. And over the years, she and her son knew each other's hearts so very well. She would often watch as he left the house, walking out into the desert to pray. She too asked the Lord each day to open up her heart. "I know, Father, you have called him for a special reason." She would pray that every morning. "But let me be willing to let him go. Let me recognize when it is his time." Her heart felt a small yet painful twitch at the very moment she heard, "Out of wine? How can that be?" It was the groom. He was in shock over what the waiters were telling him. The groom knew it would be a dishonor and a disaster for his bride and for her family to run out of wine at their wedding feast. Panic was all over his face. Mary then saw the bride across the room who just moments earlier had been laughing without a care in the world. Something had to be done. She saw Jesus walking alone out in the courtyard, and she walked out to join him, stopping him with a little hug. "Yeshua," she said tenderly, using his childhood nickname. He wrapped his arms around her and put his cheek up against hers. "Mother, are you enjoying yourself?" She nodded at him and searched his face and his warm, dark eyes that she knew and loved so well. But today she sensed something different in him and in herself. She then knew, and he knew as well, his time had come. She hugged her son tighter, wanting to keep him close, to protect him, to be with him. She didn't want to let him go. It was her old struggle. Was she protecting him, or was she protecting herself? At that moment, the words came back once again, "Your heart will be pierced." As she did over and over again, every single day, she opened her spirit to the Lord and quietly thought, "Open my heart. Give me the freedom to let him go. Let me not be afraid." She let go of the embrace and looked up at him and said, "Yahshua, they've run out of wine." That's all that she said. He looked past her into the house at the family and saw from the disturbance that it was true. Jesus looked at his mother with a warm smile of love, but also of knowledge as to what awaited him. He said, "My lady, how does your concern affect me? My hour has not yet come." He was speaking about the hour of his death, but he knew in a very real way, so too did she, that what he was about to do would be the first step of a journey that would only end at the cross. He stopped and looked into her dark eyes that matched his own, and giving his beloved mother a wink, deep peace came upon her, and she knew her struggle was over. She smiled at him and then went straight to the servers and said, "I know about the wine. I know you need some help." And pointing to her son, she said, "Do whatever he tells you." They looked bewildered, but they nodded their heads. Well, Mary saw Jesus return to the house with deep serenity, with a sense of power in his eyes. He walked up to the two servants and gestured to the water jars lining the walls. "Fill these with water." They were confused. The ceremonial washings were already over with. Who needed more water in the jars? But they did as he asked. And after the servants poured water into all of the jars, Jesus said, "Now draw out a cup and take it to the head waiter." He walked back to his table. It made no sense, but they saw Mary nodding toward them, so they carried a full cup to the head waiter. He took a sip, glancing over at the full jars, and with a very surprised look on his face, he went to the groom and said, "Where did you get this?" The two servants looked at each other, open-mouthed and saying to one another, "Didn't we fill the jars with water? But look, it's now wine." Mary watched as the head waiter said astonishingly to the groom, "This wine is magnificent. You are saving it? When I serve a wedding, I usually use the best wine at the beginning and a cheaper wine later. But this is perfect. You saved it for so late in the feast." Mary watched the bridegroom's puzzled but relieved face and the head waiter giving orders to the servants to serve the wine. The music began again. The bridegroom thanked God for saving his bride from being dishonored. He rejoined the festivities and told his family, "It's a miracle." Mary felt joy and peace, and she moved to rejoin the women at the table. But she glanced over at the servants. They were all whispering to each other, pointing at Jesus. It had begun. His life would never be the same, and neither would hers. She sat at the end of the bench and paused for just a second, opening her hands on her lap, whispering, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. May it be done to me according to your word." And she turned back and joined the women at the table. Her son was back alone in the courtyard, quietly yet purposefully gazing to the south, the direction of Calvary.